When he and his sister aged out of the system, all they inherited was a forgotten ranch and a mountain of debt. But what they found in the cellar wasn't just a solution. It was a secret that would redefine their entire past. And if you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, I hope you'll stick around and subscribe, because this is for you. The last day smelled like floor polish and paperwork. For 18 years, my life had been a series of rooms I didn't own, filled with sounds I couldn't control. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant clang of a pot in the kitchen, the carefully modulated voices of staff who were trained to sound like they cared. Now, at 18, I was being released, not from a prison, but from a life that had been a holding pattern since I was 6 years old. The state called it aging out. It felt more like being pushed off a cliff with a polite smile and a hearty good luck. My sister Mia was standing beside me in the director's office. She was 16, and because I was now her legal guardian by a razor-thin margin of bureaucracy, she was being released with me. Her freedom was conditional on mine. It was one more weight I didn't know how to carry. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, the one she'd arrived with all those years ago. Its button eyes stared blankly at Mr. Henderson, the facility director, a man whose face was a tired collection of neutral expressions. "So, Leo," he said, steepling his fingers on his desk. The gesture seemed intended to convey wisdom, but it just looked like he was bored. "This is it. You're an adult now." He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished wood. It made a dry, final sound. "Everything you need is in here. Your birth certificate, social security card, a list of resources. And this." He tapped a smaller, more delicate envelope resting on top. It was cream-colored, with unfamiliar, looping handwriting. "This arrived for you from a law firm last week. It pertains to your grandmother's estate." My grandmother. The words felt foreign. She was a ghost, a half-remembered scent of cinnamon and the vague outline of a smiling face in a photograph I'd long since lost. The official story was that she'd abandoned us, dropped us at a state intake office one rainy Tuesday, and never looked back. For years I'd nurtured a cold, hard knot of resentment for her. It was easier than feeling the loss. "Her estate?" I asked. My voice was rough. I hadn't expected to speak. "That's right," Mr. Henderson said, his gaze flickering toward the clock on the wall. "It seems she passed away some time ago. There was property, a ranch, I believe. The lawyers have been trying to locate you and Mia for a while." Mia's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide and perpetually hopeful, fixed on me. "A ranch?" she whispered. The word was full of impossible magic, like castle or treasure. I didn't let myself feel it. Hope was a dangerous thing in our world. It was a currency we couldn't afford. "And?" I prompted, looking back at Mr. Henderson. He gave a slight, uncomfortable cough. "Well, that's for the lawyers to discuss with you. There's a name and number in the packet. They're expecting your call." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting, the end of our life here. "Leo, Mia, it's been a long road. We wish you the best." We were escorted to the front door, the same one we'd been carried through as scared, crying children. A social worker handed me a debit card with $500 on it, the state's parting gift. A final handshake, a click of the heavy door, and then silence. We were standing on the sidewalk, the city noise a sudden, overwhelming roar. We had one duffel bag each, filled with clothes that never quite felt like our own, and a handful of personal items. And we had an envelope that might contain a home, or just another dead end. Mia looked up at me, her face pale. "Leo, what do we do?" I looked down at the envelope, then at her. For the first time, the cold knot in my chest wasn't anger. It was fear. Pure, uncut, paralyzing fear. I was 18 years old, holding my entire world and my sister's in my hands, and I had no idea which way was up. The law office of Albright and Finch was in a part of the city we'd only ever seen on TV. Tall glass buildings reflected the gray sky, and people in expensive suits moved with a purpose that felt alien. The receptionist looked us up and down, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. We were clearly not their usual clientele. But the name on the envelope got us through the door and into a small, quiet conference room with a view of the sprawling metropolis below. Mrs. Albright was not what I expected. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, pragmatic demeanor. There was no pity in her gaze, which I was grateful for. She treated us like clients, not like charity cases. "Leo, Mia," she began, after offering us water we were too nervous to accept. "Thank you for coming in. I was your grandmother's attorney. Her name was Eleanor Vance." She said the name as if we should know it, but it was just a name, a blank space. "As Mr. Henderson mentioned, your grandmother left you her property, a 40-acre ranch in a town called Havenwood, about 4 hours north of here." Mia let out a small gasp. 40 acres. It sounded like a kingdom. Ms. Albright held up a hand, her expression softening slightly. "Now, before you get too excited, we need to be very clear about the situation. The property is not unencumbered." I didn't know what unencumbered meant, but I knew it wasn't good. She slid a thick folder across the table, a twin to the one Mr. Henderson had given me. It was filled with documents covered in dense legal text. "Your grandmother took out a significant mortgage on the ranch several years before she disappeared. She also fell behind on the property taxes. The total debt currently stands at $112,000. The air rushed out of the room. The number was so large it was abstract. It was a mountain. Mia's face fell, the brief spark of hope extinguished. I felt a bitter, familiar taste in my mouth. Of course, there was always a catch. The world didn't just give you things. "Furthermore," Ms. Albright continued, her tone even, "the bank that holds the mortgage has initiated foreclosure proceedings, and a development corporation, Horizon Holdings, has been trying to acquire the land for years. They've made an official offer to buy the estate out of probate." She pushed another paper toward us, an offer letter. "They are offering $120,000. I did the math quickly. Pay the debt and we'd be left with $8,000. Minus legal fees, probate costs, what would be left? Maybe $5,000? Enough to rent a cheap apartment for a few months before we were back on the street. It was a slightly more comfortable cliff to be pushed off of, but it was the same fall. "So we sell," I said, my voice flat. It wasn't a question. "That is the simplest option," Ms. Albright agreed. "It would clear the debts and give you a small amount of starting capital. It's a clean break." A clean break. The phrase echoed in my head. That's what they'd said about our grandmother. "What's the alternative?" Mia asked, her voice small but firm. It was the first time she'd spoken to Ms. Albright. Ms. Albright looked at Mia, a flicker of something, respect maybe, in her eyes. The alternative is you take possession of the ranch. You would have 90 days to pay the outstanding mortgage and taxes in full. If you can't, the bank forecloses, the property is auctioned off, and you would likely receive nothing. Horizon Holdings would almost certainly be the buyer at auction. It wasn't a choice, it was a joke. Pay $112,000 in 90 days? We had 500. We'll sell, I said again, more firmly this time. I looked at Mia, trying to convey the stark reality with my eyes. This was the only sane path. Ms. Albright nodded slowly. I understand. However, your grandmother left very specific instructions in her will. She stipulated that you both must visit the property before making any decision. It was a non-negotiable clause. You have to physically go there, see it for yourselves. She paused. She also left you this. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key. It was old, ornate, nothing like the modern keys on my facility keyring. Along with it was a folded, hand-drawn map. The key is to the front door. The map will get you there from the bus station in Havenwood. I've already purchased your bus tickets for tomorrow morning. Think of it as your grandmother's last request. The whole thing felt like a cruel game, a forced pilgrimage to see the thing we could never have. But the will was the will. We were trapped. That night, we stayed in a cheap motel near the bus station, the $500 already starting to dwindle. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. Mia cried herself to sleep, her shoulders shaking silently in the bed next to mine. I lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the silver key cold in my palm. I hated my grandmother. I hated her for this elaborate, painful gesture, for dangling a home in front of us only to snatch it away, for making us perform this last act of a tragedy she had written. I didn't know it yet, but the story I was telling myself was wrong, every single part of it. The key in my hand wasn't the end of a sad story. It was the beginning of a true one. The bus ride was a slow bleed of gray city into green country. For the first hour, Mia and I sat in silence, watching the familiar landscape of concrete and steel give way to suburbs, then to strip malls, then finally to wide open fields. The bus was old, the seats worn smooth, and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound between us. I kept replaying the conversation with Ms. Albright in my head. $112,000, 90 days. It was an impossible number, an impossible timeline. Selling was the only logical move. Get it over with. Take the few $1,000s and try to build some semblance of a life. But as the miles rolled by, something began to shift in me. The endless green was startling. I'd spent my entire life surrounded by buildings, fences, and walls. Out here, the sky was huge, a vast pale blue canvas that seemed to go on forever. The trees weren't neatly planted in sidewalk squares. They were wild, chaotic, growing in dense forests that looked ancient and imposing. It was beautiful, but it was also intimidating. It was a world that operated on rules I didn't understand. Mia had her face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging a small circle on the window. She hadn't said a word since we left the motel. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She didn't turn. "She made us do this, Leo. Why? Why make us go see it when we can't keep it?" Her voice was thick with a grief that felt too big for her small frame. "I don't know," I said, and it was the honest truth. Maybe she was just, I don't know. Maybe she didn't realize how bad things would get. The excuse felt flimsy even as I said it. "Or maybe she just didn't care," Mia whispered. Her words stung, because they were the same ones that had been echoing in my own mind for years. It was the story we'd been told, the one we'd learned to survive with. We were the children who were left behind, unwanted. That was our foundation. After 4 hours, the bus hissed to a stop in Havenwood. The station was just a peeling bench outside a general store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The air smelled different here, clean, earthy, with the scent of damp soil and pine needles. The city's perpetual hum was gone, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustle of wind in the trees. It was so quiet, it felt loud. We were the only ones who got off. The bus driver gave us a curious look before closing the doors and pulling away, leaving us in a cloud of diesel fumes. We stood there on the side of the road with our 2 duffel bags, feeling like we'd been dropped onto a different planet. I pulled out the hand-drawn map. It was sketched in faded ink on brittle, yellowed paper. It showed the main road, a turnoff onto a smaller dirt road called Miller's Lane, and then a long, winding path marked with an X. Vance Ranch, it said in my grandmother's same looping script. The map noted it was about 3 miles from the bus stop. 3 miles felt like 100. "We walk?" Mia asked, her voice small. "Looks like it," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I slung my bag over my shoulder. "Come on, the sooner we get there, the sooner we can leave." The walk was long. The sun beat down, and the asphalt of the main road quickly gave way to the packed dirt and gravel of Miller's Lane. There were no sidewalks here, just overgrown weeds and wildflowers lining the path. We passed a few houses, set far back from the road, with long driveways and sleepy-looking dogs that lifted their heads to watch us pass. No one was out. The whole town felt deserted. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it. A rusted wrought-iron gate hanging crookedly on one hinge. A simple wooden sign, weathered to a pale gray, was nailed to a post next to it. The letters were faded, but I could just make them out. Vance. We stepped through the gate. The driveway was more of a suggestion than a road. 2 tire ruts overgrown with weeds that scraped against our legs. It wound through a grove of tall, whispering pine trees before opening up into a clearing. And there it was, the ranch. It was a wreck. The word ranch had conjured images of a stately, sprawling farmhouse with white fences. This was not that. The house was a simple, 1-story wooden structure, its paint peeling in long, curling strips. The roof on the porch sagged dramatically in the middle, looking like it might collapse at any moment. The windows were clouded with grime, and one was boarded up with a piece of plywood. The land around it wasn't a neat pasture. It was a wild meadow of waist-high grass and thorny bushes. To one side, a large barn stood listing to the left, its big doors hanging open like a gaping mouth. It looked abandoned. It looked forgotten. It looked exactly how I felt. Mia stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. I expected her to cry, to voice her disappointment. Instead, she said, "It's real." I looked at her, then back at the dilapidated house. She was right. As broken as it was real. It was wood and nails and glass. It was a place. Our place. The thought was terrifying. We walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch, carefully avoiding the sagging middle section. I pulled out the silver key. It felt ancient in my hand. I slid it into the lock on the front door. It was stiff, and I had to jiggle it, but then I felt a satisfying, solid clunk as the bolt slid back. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on a long, groaning creak, opening into darkness. A wave of cool, musty air washed over us. The smell of dust, of time, of a house that had been holding its breath for a decade. Sunlight streamed in through the dirty windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in thick golden shafts. The furniture was still here, shrouded in white cloths, like a room full of ghosts. There was a sofa, a couple of armchairs, a stone fireplace filled with old ash. We stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind us with a soft click, plunging us into shadow. For a long moment, we just stood there, letting our eyes adjust. This was it, the place we came from, the place that had been waiting for us all this time. We didn't know it yet, but we weren't just here to see a piece of property. We were here to dig up the truth, and it was buried deep in the dark, damp earth beneath our feet. The house was a time capsule. As we moved from the living room into the other spaces, it felt like we were walking through someone else's memories. We pulled the dust cloths off the furniture, revealing faded floral patterns on the sofa and dark, solid wood on a dining table set for four, as if our grandmother had just stepped out for a moment. In the kitchen, a calendar was still hanging on the wall, turned to August 10 years ago. A coffee cup sat by the sink. It was eerie, a life interrupted. Mia drifted through the rooms like a ghost herself, her fingers tracing the outlines of furniture, running over the spines of books on a dusty shelf. I was more methodical, my mind still stuck on the practical problem. We were here to fulfill a legal obligation. Look at the property, then call Ms. Albright and tell her to sell. But the house was starting to work its magic on me, a slow, creeping sense of belonging that I tried to fight. I found the main bedroom. It was simple, a large, unmade bed, a tall wooden wardrobe, and a dressing table with a dusty oval mirror. On the table, there was a collection of small, ordinary things: a silver-backed hairbrush, a small bottle of perfume, and a framed photograph. I picked it up, wiping the dust away with my thumb. It was a picture of a woman with a kind, smiling face, and the same looping, joyful energy as the handwriting on the map. She was holding two small children in her arms, a little boy with a serious expression and a tiny girl with a wild mess of dark hair. It was us. I didn't remember the photo being taken. I didn't remember the woman's arms around me. But looking at it, I felt a pang, a phantom limb of a memory. This was Eleanor Vance. This was our grandmother. "Leo, look," Mia called from the hallway. I put the photo down and followed her voice. She was standing in front of a small door I hadn't noticed, tucked away under the main staircase. It was made of thick, dark wood, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. "The cellar," she said. I pulled on the ring. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, my feet sliding on the dusty floorboards. It was stuck fast, swollen shut with a decade of disuse and damp. "It's no use," I said, breathing heavily. "It's warped." "We have to get in," Mia insisted, her voice urgent. "There might be things down there, tools, or something." Something in her tone made me pause. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a strange, unshakable certainty. I looked back at the legal folder Ms. Albright had given me, which I dropped on the dining table. I remembered her words. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions." I'd assumed she just meant the clause about visiting. But what if there was more? I went back and got the folder, sifting through the dense pages of legalese. Tucked into a side pocket was a separate, smaller envelope. It wasn't from the law firm. It was the same cream-colored paper as the note on Mr. Henderson's desk, with the same looping handwriting. My name was on the front. I tore it open. The note was short. Leo, if you're reading this, you've made it home. I'm sorry for the state it's in. I'm sorry for so much. Don't sell, not yet. Everything you need to understand is in the cellar. The key isn't for the lock on the door. It's for the storm. Love, Grandma. The storm? Mia asked, reading over my shoulder. What does that mean? I looked from the note to the cellar door, then back to the silver key still in my pocket. The key isn't for the lock on the door. The front door hadn't needed a key. It was unlocked. No, wait. I had used the key. I put it in the lock and it had turned. Or had it? I remembered the door was stiff, that I'd had to jiggle it. The clunk I heard. Maybe it wasn't the lock. Maybe it was just the door settling. I had assumed the key was for the house. But what if it wasn't? We went back to the cellar door. There was no keyhole, just the iron ring. We looked for another way in, circling the outside of the house. Around back, half hidden by overgrown lilac bushes, we found it. A pair of slanted wooden doors set into the ground, a bulkhead entrance to the cellar. It was secured by a heavy wooden beam and a large, rusty padlock. The padlock had a keyhole that, even from a distance, looked old and ornate. My heart started to pound. I slid the silver key into the rusty lock. It fit perfectly. With a grating squeal of protest, the lock turned. We lifted the heavy doors, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into darkness. A cool, earthy smell, the scent of deep, undisturbed places, rose up to meet us. We found a flashlight in a kitchen drawer that miraculously still had some life in it. Its beam cut a weak yellow circle through the oppressive dark. I went first, Mia close behind, her hand gripping the back of my jacket. The stone steps were slick with damp. The cellar was larger than I expected, the stone foundation of the house forming a wide, low-ceilinged room. It was filled with the clutter of a lifetime. Old canning jars, broken furniture, stacks of newspapers tied with twine. The flashlight beam danced over the mess. It was just a junk room. My brief surge of hope began to curdle back into disappointment. This was another dead end. Another one of my grandmother's cruel games. "What are we even looking for?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the dark. "The storm," I said, the word feeling foolish. She said it was for the storm. My light caught something in the far corner. A low wooden platform, and on top of it, a large, dark shape covered by a heavy canvas tarp. It looked different from the rest of the junk, more deliberate. I walked toward it, the beam of the flashlight steady now. I pulled back the dusty tarp. Underneath was a heavy, iron-banded footlocker, a seaman's chest. It was old, the wood dark and scarred, and it was sealed with another padlock, even bigger and rustier than the one on the outside door. But this one had no keyhole. "It's locked," Mia said, her voice laced with frustration. I ran my hands over the chest, looking for a seam, a latch, anything. Nothing. Then my fingers brushed against a small, tarnished brass plaque screwed into the lid. There were words engraved on it. I angled the flashlight to read them. "In case of storm, break seal." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. I looked around the cellar, and my eyes landed on a heavy sledgehammer leaning against the stone wall. It was meant for splitting firewood, but it would do. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It was heavy, solid. I positioned the head of the hammer against the rusty hasp of the padlock. "Stand back," I told Mia. I swung. The sound of metal on metal was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, ringing clang that vibrated up my arms. The lock held. I swung again, harder this time, putting all my frustration, all my fear, all my years of anger into the blow. There was a sharp crack, and the rusted metal of the hasp fractured. One more hit, and it shattered, falling to the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, we just stood there, breathing heavily in the sudden silence, the air thick with the smell of rust and dust. Slowly, I knelt down and lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The beam of the flashlight fell inside. I wasn't sure what I expected. Gold bars, antique jewelry, some mythical treasure. The reality was both more mundane and infinitely more shocking. The chest was filled with bundles of cash, stacks and stacks of $50 and $100 bills wrapped in simple rubber bands. It was an impossible amount of money, more than I had ever seen in my life. But that wasn't what made me freeze. Lying on top of the money, right in the center, was a thick stack of envelopes, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The same cream-colored paper, the same looping script. The top envelope just had 2 words on it: "Read me first." My hands trembled as I lifted the stack of letters out of the chest. This was it. This was the something Mia had been so sure of. This was the reason we were here. The money was the answer to our immediate problem, but the letters felt like the answer to everything else. I untied the ribbon and opened the first one. The flashlight beam shook as I held the page, and I began to read my grandmother's words aloud into the darkness. "My dearest Leo and Mia," the letter began, her handwriting a beautiful, steady current across the page. "If you are reading this, then it means 2 things. First, that I am gone. And second, that despite all my fears, you have found your way home. I know you have questions. I know you have probably spent your lives hating me. I don't blame you. The story you were told, the one about me abandoning you, is the story I needed everyone to believe. It was the only way I could keep you safe." I had to stop and take a breath. The words felt like a physical blow. Keep us safe. From what? I continued reading, my voice barely a whisper. "The truth is, I never wanted to leave you. You were my whole world. After your parents died, you were all I had left. But this land, this ranch, it's more than just a home. It's been in our family for generations, and there are people who have wanted it for just as long. Not for the house, but for the water rights that come with it. A corporation, a predecessor to the one you're probably dealing with now, tried to force me out years ago. They used threats, intimidation, legal tricks. I fought them. I fought them with everything I had. But then they started watching the house. They took pictures of you playing in the yard. A man stopped me in town one day and described your school bus route to me, Leo. He told me what time you got on, what time you got off. He told me Mia's favorite playground. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. They were telling me that if I didn't give up the ranch, they would take what I loved most. They would take you. Mia made a small, choked sound behind me. I reached back, and my hand found hers in the dark. Her fingers were ice cold. I was trapped, the letter went on. If I sold, we'd have nothing and nowhere to go. If I stayed, I was putting your lives in danger every single day. So I came up with a third option, a terrible, desperate plan. I had to disappear. I had to make it look like I had run away, like I was an irresponsible old woman who couldn't handle the pressure of raising 2 children. I had to become the villain in your story so that the real villains would leave you alone. They wouldn't have any leverage over me if they thought I didn't care about you. So I packed a bag, drove to the city, and left you at the only place I knew would keep you physically safe, even if it broke your hearts. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It broke my heart, too. I spent the next 10 years on the run, in a way. I took odd jobs, cash only, moving from town to town. I lived as cheaply as I could, and every spare dollar I ever made, I saved. I would drive back here in the dead of night, once or twice a year, to make a deposit in this chest. The mortgage, the taxes, I tried to keep up, but it was hard. I knew I was falling behind. I knew I was creating a debt that would fall on your shoulders. This money, this is my apology. It should be enough to clear the slate, to pay what is owed and give you a real start. The choice of what to do with it, and with the ranch, is yours. You can sell it and walk away. I wouldn't blame you. After everything, you deserve an easy life. But I hope you don't. I hope you see this place not as a burden, but as a legacy. Our legacy. This land is in your blood. I gave up my life with you so that one day you might have a life here. Whatever you choose, know this. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single second. Every night I looked at the moon and hoped you were looking at it too. I love you. I have always loved you. Your loving Grandma, Eleanor. When I finished reading, the silence in the cellar was absolute. The weak beam of the flashlight illuminated the tear tracks on Mia's face. She wasn't making a sound, just letting them fall. I felt a strange emptiness inside me, a hollow space where a decade of anger and resentment had lived. It was all gone, replaced by a vast, aching grief. A grief for the woman in the photograph, a grief for the life we could have had. I reached into the chest and picked up another envelope. It was thicker than the first. Inside wasn't just a letter, but a stack of documents. Old newspaper clippings about a company called Mountain Stream Development and their aggressive land acquisition tactics. Copies of threatening letters, unsigned. A sworn affidavit, notarized by a lawyer in another state, detailing the threats against us. She had been building a case. She had been fighting for us, even in exile. I cried. I hadn't cried since I was 6 years old, sitting on a hard plastic chair in the intake office, watching the taillights of my grandmother's car disappear into the rain. I thought I had forgotten how. But now, in the dark, damp cellar of a house I'd never known, I cried. I cried for the grandmother I had hated, who had been my fiercest protector. I cried for the little boy who believed he was worthless. I cried for my sister, who had grown up without a home. And I cried for the sheer, overwhelming weight of the truth. Our entire lives, the story we had built our identities on, had been a lie. A necessary, protective, soul-crushing lie. We stayed down in that cellar for a long time, the flashlight slowly dimming, the darkness closing in. The money was a physical weight in the chest, a tangible solution to a practical problem. But the letters were heavier. They were an inheritance of a different kind, not of property or wealth, but of truth. And with that truth came a choice. The easy path was still there. Take the money, sell the ranch, walk away clean. But now it felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of the woman who had sacrificed everything so we could stand right here, in this moment, and make this choice. I looked at Mia, her face streaked with dirt and tears in the dying light. "What do we do?" I asked her, my voice hoarse. She didn't hesitate. She looked from the chest to the letters in my hand, to the dark corners of the cellar that was now ours. "We stay," she said. "We fight." That night, sleep was impossible. We brought a few of the blankets from the house down to the cellar, along with the letters and the flashlight. We couldn't bear to be too far from the chest, from the tangible proof that our whole world had been turned upside down. We sat on the cold stone floor, the dimming flashlight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and we read. We read every single letter Eleanor had written. There were letters for birthdays she had missed. For my 10th, she wrote about how she imagined I was getting tall, how she hoped I was still kind. For Mia's 8th, she wrote about a field of wildflowers she had seen that reminded her of Mia's laugh. There were letters for holidays, a lonely Christmas spent in a motel room in Nevada where she'd bought 2 small presents, a toy car for me, a doll for Mia, and left them on the empty pillow beside her. She described our parents, her son and his wife, telling us stories we'd never heard. How our father could fix any engine, how our mother had a beautiful singing voice. She was giving us back our history, piece by piece. With every letter, the ghost of our grandmother became a real person. A woman who was funny and stubborn and fiercely loving. A woman who was trapped by impossible circumstances and made an impossible choice. The anger I'd held on to for so long had completely dissolved, leaving behind a profound, aching sadness. We hadn't been abandoned. We had been protected. The institution we'd grown up in hadn't been our home. It had been our hiding place. As dawn approached, the flashlight finally died, plunging us into absolute darkness. We sat there in the silence, the letters a physical weight in my lap. The enormity of it all was crashing down on me. The money in the chest wasn't a lottery win, it was a weapon. It was the ammunition our grandmother had spent a decade gathering for a fight she couldn't finish herself. And she had just handed it to me. To an 18-year-old kid who, 24 hours ago, thought his biggest problem was figuring out how to pay for a security deposit on a tiny apartment. I felt a surge of panic, cold and sharp. I wasn't a fighter. I was a survivor. I knew how to keep my head down, how to not make waves, how to be invisible. That's how you got through the system. But this required the opposite. This required standing up, making noise, claiming something. It required being seen. I left Mia sleeping by the chest and climbed the stone steps out of the cellar. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The morning air was cool and crisp. I walked out into the overgrown field, the wet grass soaking my jeans. The house stood silhouetted against the dawn, sagging and broken, but there. It was still standing. I looked at its peeling paint, its crooked porch, its boarded-up window. For 12 years, I had dreamed of having a home, a place that was safe, a place that was mine. And now, here it was. But it wasn't the neat, perfect house of my dreams. It was a ruin, tied to a mountain of debt and a fight against a faceless corporation. It was a gift wrapped in a curse. I thought about the offer from Horizon Holdings, $120,000. We could take the money from the chest, pay off the $112,000 in debt, and then sell to them. We'd walk away with over $100,000 in cash, free and clear. No fight, no struggle. A clean slate. We could go anywhere, do anything. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. It was the easy way out my grandmother had said we deserved. And the thought of it made me feel sick. It would mean her sacrifice was for nothing. It would mean the last 10 years of her lonely, hidden life were just a prelude to us handing her legacy over to the very people she was running from. It would mean that in the end, they won. I sank to my knees in the wet grass, the full weight of the decision crushing me. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't strong enough for this. I was just a kid who was supposed to be his sister's guardian, her protector. Taking the easy money was the safest bet for her. Trying to fight and keep this place, what if we failed? We could lose everything. We'd be back to where we started, with nothing but the clothes on our backs. The responsibility was suffocating. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where the entire story of your life is rewritten in an instant, and you're left standing in the rubble, holding a choice that feels too heavy for any one person to carry. A choice where the right path is the hardest one, and the easy path feels like a betrayal of everything you now know to be true. If you have, I want you to know you're not alone. So many of us in this community have faced that crossroads. It's the moment that defines you. It's not the past that makes you who you are. It's the choice you make when you finally understand it. I stayed out there in the field until the sun was fully up, feeling the warmth on my face. I thought about my grandmother, alone in some dingy motel room, carefully bundling up cash, writing letters she didn't know if we would ever read. She never took the easy way out. She chose the hardest path imaginable, all for us. How could I do any less? I stood up, my legs stiff. My decision was made. It wasn't a logical choice. It wasn't the safe choice, but it was the only choice I could live with. I walked back into the house, my steps sure and steady for the first time. I found Mia awake in the kitchen, trying to get the old tap to produce more than a rusty trickle of water. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face. "Leo?" "We're staying," I said. There was no doubt in my voice anymore. "This is our home. We're going to fix it. We're going to keep it." A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her in years. It was like watching the sun come out from behind the clouds. "Okay," she said. "What do we do first?" The first call was to Ms. Albright. I found a spot on the porch where my cheap cell phone got a single wavering bar of service. When she answered, her voice was as crisp and professional as it had been in her office. "Leo," she said, "I trust you've had a chance to see the property. I have the paperwork for the sale to Horizon Holdings ready. You just need to give me verbal authorization, and I can begin the process." I took a deep breath. "We're not selling, Ms. Albright." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long, loaded silence. "I see," she said finally, her tone unreadable. "Leo, we discussed this. You have 90 days to satisfy a debt of $112,000. Forgive me for being blunt, but that seems unlikely." "We have the money," I said simply. Another pause, this one even longer. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the lawyerly skepticism warring with her curiosity. "You have the money," she repeated, no longer a statement, but a question. "My grandmother, she made provisions," I said, unwilling to explain everything over the phone. "It's complicated, but the money is here. I need you to tell me exactly how to pay off the bank and the back taxes. Today." I could sense her sitting up straighter in her leather chair miles away. "You're serious," she said. It was the first time I'd heard her sound genuinely surprised. "All right. I'll need to verify the funds, of course. This is highly irregular. But if what you're saying is true, yes, I can facilitate it. I'll make some calls. I'll call you back with instructions for a wire transfer." The second call was harder. It was to Horizon Holdings. Their number was on the offer letter. I knew I should probably let Ms. Albright handle it, but I needed to do it myself. I needed them to hear it from me. A man with a smooth corporate voice answered. "My name is Leo Vance," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'm the owner of the Vance property in Havenwood." "Ah, Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice instantly warmer. "We've been looking forward to hearing from you. We're prepared to make the transfer as soon as you and your lawyer sign the paperwork. We can have this all settled for you by the end of the week." "There's been a change of plans," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "The property is not for sale." The man chuckled, a dismissive, patronizing sound. "Mr. Vance, I think you might be misunderstanding your situation. That property has significant liabilities. Our offer is the only thing standing between you and foreclosure." "It's a very generous offer, I might add." "It's not for sale," I repeated, putting a hard edge on the words. "Not to you, not to anyone. This is our home. I'd suggest you stop sending letters and stop making calls. You're not welcome here." The silence on the other end was cold. The fake warmth was gone, replaced by something sharp and unpleasant. "You're making a mistake, kid," he said, his voice low. "No," I said, looking out at the overgrown land that was ours. "I'm fixing one." And I hung up. My hand was shaking. It was a small act of defiance, a 3-minute phone call, but it felt monumental. It was the first time in my life I had ever stood up to a powerful, unseen force and said no. Ms. Albright called back an hour later with wiring instructions. The process was a logistical nightmare. It involved me taking a photo of the cash with that day's newspaper, a trip back to Havenwood to find a bank that could handle a wire transfer of that size, and a long, tense conversation with a bank manager who looked at me and my duffel bag full of cash with extreme suspicion. But Ms. Albright worked her magic, vouching for me, sending faxes, and assuring everyone that this was, in her words, an unconventional but legitimate estate settlement. By the end of the day, it was done. $112,000 were gone, transferred from our hands into the accounts of the bank and the county tax office. We were left with a little over $30,000 from our grandmother's chest. It felt like a fortune. Walking out of the bank and back toward the ranch, the world felt different. The air was lighter. The weight of the debt was gone. The threat of foreclosure was gone. The ranch was ours. Truly, completely ours. We had a long road ahead. The house was a wreck. The land was a mess. And we had no idea how to fix any of it. But as we walked up the overgrown driveway, it didn't feel daunting. It felt like a beginning. We stood on the porch, looking out at our 40 acres. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the wild meadow. The house was quiet. "We did it," Mia whispered, her voice full of awe. "Grandma did it," I corrected her softly. "We just finished the job." That night, we slept in the house for the first time, in the 2 small bedrooms down the hall from our grandmother's. We dragged the mattresses onto the floor and used old blankets we'd found in a trunk. It was cold, the wind whistling through cracks in the window frames. Every creak of the old house made me jump. But for the first time in my life, I felt safe. I wasn't in a temporary bed in a room full of strangers. I was in my own room, in my own house. My sister was just down the hall. We were home. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work. The $30,000 that had seemed like a fortune began to shrink as we faced the reality of restoring a neglected property. The first priority was making the house livable. We hired a local handyman, a gruff but fair man named George, to look at the sagging porch roof. He quoted us a price that made my stomach clench, but he also showed me how to do the work myself, guiding me through the process of jacking up the roof, replacing the rotted support beams, and laying down new floorboards. Every day was a lesson in things I'd never known. I learned how to patch drywall, how to replace a broken window pane, how to unclog a drain that hadn't been used in a decade. Mia took charge of the inside. She scrubbed every surface of the house, washing away years of dust and neglect. She aired out the musty rooms, washed the ghostly dust cloths, and polished the old wooden furniture until it gleamed. Slowly, painstakingly, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. We made trips to the general store in Havenwood, stocking up on supplies. The owner, a woman named Carol, had been wary of us at first. 2 kids from the city, showing up out of nowhere. But as we kept coming back, as she saw the dirt under our fingernails and the exhaustion on our faces, her demeanor softened. She started giving us advice on gardening, telling us which local contractors were honest, and asking how the work was going. One afternoon, she sent us home with a warm, freshly baked apple pie. "A welcome to the neighborhood," she'd said with a small smile. It was the first time anyone had ever welcomed us to a neighborhood. The biggest challenge was the land itself. 40 acres of overgrown weeds and thorny brush. We bought a second-hand ride-on mower and a couple of heavy-duty scythes. The work was backbreaking. We spent entire days under the hot sun, clearing sections of the field, bit by bit. With every patch of land we cleared, it felt like we were letting the property breathe again. We uncovered old stone walls that marked the original pastures and a small, forgotten apple orchard near the barn. The barn was a project in itself. It was structurally sound, despite its lean, but it was filled with junk and rot. We spent a week just clearing it out, hauling out broken equipment and nests of critters that had made it their home. But underneath the mess, we found treasures. A sturdy old workbench with a vise still attached. A set of antique tools, rusty but salvageable. And in the hayloft, tucked away in a corner, we found our father's old toolbox. It was filled with his wrenches and sockets, each one engraved with his initials. Holding them, I felt a connection to the man I'd never known, another piece of the history our grandmother's letters had started to fill in. One evening, after a long day of clearing brush, Ms. Albright called. "Leo," she said, her voice warm, "I just wanted to check in. I received confirmation from the bank and the county. The liens on the property are officially released. The title is clean. It's in your and Mia's names, free and clear." I sank down onto the newly repaired porch steps, looking out at the field we had begun to tame. "Thank you, Ms. Albright, for everything." "You did the hard part, Leo," she said. "I've been a lawyer for 30 years. I've seen families tear each other apart over inheritances worth millions. What you and your sister have done, it's remarkable. Your grandmother would be proud." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Proud. I'd spent my whole life feeling like a disappointment, a problem to be managed. The idea that I could make someone proud, especially the grandmother who had sacrificed so much for me, was a powerful, overwhelming feeling. After I hung up, Mia came and sat next to me. We didn't speak for a while, just watched as fireflies began to rise from the tall grass at the edge of the field, their tiny lights blinking on and off in the deepening twilight. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The city? The noise?" I thought about it. I thought about the concrete, the sirens, the constant pressing energy of millions of people. I thought about the group home, the rigid schedules, the feeling of being a number in a system. "No," I said, and I was surprised by how true it was. I don't miss any of it. All my life, I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could hear myself think. I looked at her. "What about you?" She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I miss pizza delivery," she said with a little laugh. "But that's it. Here, I feel like I can breathe, like I'm a real person." We were real people. We weren't case files anymore. We were Leo and Mia Vance of the Vance Ranch. We had a history, a home, and for the first time, a future that we were building with our own 2 hands. The work was far from over. The house still needed a new roof, the fields needed to be plowed and planted, the barn needed major repairs. But looking out at the fireflies blinking in the darkness, I wasn't scared. I was hopeful. A few months passed. Summer bled into a cool, crisp autumn. The leaves on the trees in the woods surrounding our property turned brilliant shades of red and gold. We had fallen into a rhythm, a routine of work and rest that was dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by a bell on a wall. The ranch was changing, and so were we. The house, once a hollow shell, was now filled with the smells of Mia's cooking and the sound of music from a small radio we'd bought. The fields we'd cleared were covered in a green carpet of winter rye, a cover crop to help heal the soil. We had a long-term plan, pieced together from library books and advice from George and Carol. We were going to fix the orchard, raise chickens, maybe get a few goats next spring. We were becoming farmers. One afternoon, I was up on a ladder cleaning out the gutters before the winter rain started when I saw a car coming up our long driveway. It wasn't George's old truck or Carol's station wagon. It was a sleek black sedan that looked completely out of place against the rustic landscape. My stomach tightened. I knew who it was before the car even stopped. A man in an expensive suit got out. It was the kind of suit I'd seen in the city, worn by men who never got their hands dirty. He had smooth, dark hair and an easy, confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the face of corporate power. "Leo Vance?" he asked, walking toward the porch. "I am," I said, climbing down the ladder. I wiped my dirty hands on my jeans, feeling a surge of protective anger. "My name is Mark Dunham. I'm with Horizon Holdings." He extended a hand. I didn't take it. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I was in the area and I thought I'd stop by, see how you were settling in." "We're fine," I said, my voice flat. "As you can see, we're busy." He let his hand drop. His eyes scanned the property, taking in the repaired porch, the new window, the cleared fields. He was assessing, calculating. "You've done a lot of work," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Impressive. But it must be a struggle. A place this size, it's a lot for 2 young people to handle. A lot of expense." "We're managing," I said. "Look," he said, dropping the pretense of a friendly visit. "Our offer is still on the table. In fact, seeing the work you've put in, we'd be willing to increase it. $150,000. You and your sister could walk away with a serious nest egg, buy a nice condo in the city, go to college, whatever you want. No more fixing leaky roofs or pulling weeds." He was dangling the easy life in front of me again, the life of comfort and security. A year ago, I would have jumped at the offer without a second thought. But standing there, on the land my grandmother had died to protect, the offer felt like an insult. "I told you on the phone," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is our home. It's not for sale." He sighed, a theatrical display of frustration. "Son, you're sitting on a gold mine, and you're trying to live in it like it's a shack. This land has water rights that could service a community of 10,000 people. It's worth millions to the right buyer. You're being sentimental, and it's costing you a fortune." "Maybe it's not about the money," I said. He actually laughed, a short, sharp, disbelieving bark. "Everything is about the money, kid. You'll learn that." He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and tried to hand it to me. "When you come to your senses, give me a call." I just looked at him. I didn't take the card. He held it there for an awkward moment before finally placing it on the railing of the porch. "You're making a mistake," he said again, the same parting shot he'd used on the phone. "No," I said, looking past him toward the old barn where my father's initials were carved into the workbench. "I'm honoring a promise." He shook his head, a small, pitying smile on his face, and walked back to his shiny car. He drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that slowly settled back onto the land he so desperately wanted to pave over. I watched until he was gone. Then I picked up his business card, tore it into tiny pieces, and let the wind carry them away. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. The air was getting colder, and I could smell winter approaching. The encounter with Dunham hadn't scared me. It had solidified my resolve. He saw this place as a commodity, a resource to be exploited. He saw lines on a map and water rights on a deed. He didn't see the field where I had learned to use a scythe. He didn't see the porch where Mia and I sat every evening. He didn't see the kitchen where the ghost of our mother's singing voice seemed to linger. He didn't see a home. I finally understood what my grandmother had been fighting for. It wasn't just land. It was a story that stretched back through generations, a story of people who had worked this soil and lived under this sky. And she had passed that story on to us. Selling the ranch wouldn't just be selling a piece of property. It would be selling our past, our identity, our connection to the people who came before us. Inheritance, I realized, isn't about what you're given. It's about what you choose to keep. It's about what you're willing to fight for. We were given a broken-down ranch and a mountain of debt, but we were also given a choice. We chose to keep the story. We chose to fight. We chose to make this place our own. Home isn't something you're given. It's something you build. You build it with your own two hands, with sweat and tears, with love and with memory. You build it by choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. My journey didn't end with a perfect storybook farmhouse and a life of ease. The winters are hard. The work is endless. There are days when I'm so tired I can barely stand. Days when a pipe bursts or a fence breaks and I feel like I'm in over my head. But then I'll see Mia in the garden, her hands in the dirt, a look of peaceful concentration on her face. Or I'll stand on this porch and watch the sunset, and I'll feel a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, that is worth more than any amount of money Horizon Holdings could ever offer. We didn't just inherit a ranch, we inherited a second chance. A chance to build a life on our own terms, to put down roots in a place that had been waiting for us all along. A chance to heal. So I want to ask you, what's the inheritance you're fighting for? It might not be a piece of land. It might be a memory, a value, a dream your parents or grandparents had for you. It might be the chance to break a cycle and write a new story for your own family. The world will tell you to take the easy way out, to sell it cheap, to let it go. It will tell you that sentimentality is a weakness and that everything has a price. Don't listen to them. Your story is priceless. Your history is your strength. The things that truly matter are the things you can't put a price on. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your own piece of the world, I hope you'll subscribe and join our community. Share your story in the comments below. I read them all, and I promise you, you are not alone in your fight. Thank you for listening.